Have you ever had someone in your life who seemed like the most reliable, supportive person you could ever count on? Always there to listen, always there to understand, and then one day they just disappeared. No fight, no explanation, no dramatic goodbye, just silence. If that person was an INFJ, you've probably been left wondering what happened and why someone who cared so deeply could suddenly pull away when you needed them the most. The truth is, when an INFJ disappears, it isn't about weakness, cruelty, or betrayal. It's about survival. It's about reaching a point where their emotional capacity has been stretched so thin that the only way to protect themselves is to retreat into quiet detachment. What makes this so confusing for the people around them is that INFJs rarely give obvious warnings. They're the type to absorb hurt quietly, to try to fix things in the background, and to carry far more than most people even realize. They'll smile through disappointment, forgive when they're still bleeding inside, and keep showing up long after they've already been drained. But underneath that calm, caring exterior, they're taking notes. Every broken promise, every betrayal, every moment when they gave but received nothing in return, it all adds up, and once they've reached their breaking point, their decision to disappear is final. They don't slam doors, they don't scream, they vanish in a way that leaves you questioning everything because you never saw it coming. In this video, we're going to break down the psychology of why INFJs disappear when you need them most, and what it really means when they do. You'll see the hidden layers that explain their quiet withdrawal, their detachment, and the deeper truth behind their silence. And by the end, you'll understand something most people never do, that INFJ disappearance is not about abandoning others. It's about finally choosing themselves. So before we dive in, do me a favor. Don't just watch this passively. Listen with your own experiences in mind. If you've ever felt blindsided by an INFJ's silence, or if you are an INFJ who has disappeared from someone's life, you're about to see why this happens and why it's one of the most misunderstood parts of the INFJ personality. And if you find yourself nodding along, don't forget to subscribe and share your story in the comments, because I promise you someone out there is going through the exact same thing right now and needs to know they're not alone. 1, they've already been carrying more than you realize. When an INFJ disappears, the story doesn't start in the moment they walk away. It starts long before. You might think their silence came out of nowhere, but the truth is, by the time an INFJ vanishes, they've already carried more than most people could handle. They're the type who quietly absorbs tension in a room, who listens without judgment, who gives second and third chances while convincing themselves that maybe this time things will be different. They rarely complain because in their mind, holding it together for everyone else feels like the role they were born to play. The problem is, this strength often goes unnoticed. People around them see the calm, the patience, the empathy, and mistake it for an endless supply. They assume that because the INFJ isn't yelling or demanding change, everything must be fine. But what most don't realize is that INFJs internalize almost everything. When someone disappoints them, they don't always confront it directly. They replay it in their mind, they analyze it, they rationalize it, and then they tuck it away quietly, adding it to a mental ledger of hurts they almost never show. Think about that for a moment. Imagine carrying a backpack that slowly gets filled with bricks. Each lie, each broken promise, each one-sided interaction, it all gets added in silence. And because INFJs hate conflict, they don't unload those bricks on anyone else. They just keep carrying them, smiling on the outside, while inside they're getting heavier and heavier. Eventually, though, even the strongest back breaks under too much weight. When an INFJ disappears, it's usually because they've hit that breaking point. It isn't about one specific incident. It's about years of quiet accumulation. What's especially tricky is that INFJs give off the impression that they can handle anything. They're the friend who never complains, the partner who forgives, the coworker who stays late to fix the mess without making a scene. To outsiders, they look like pillars of strength. But that's the irony. Their ability to endure is exactly what makes people pile on more. And because INFJs rarely push back, people don't see the damage being done until the INFJ finally withdraws completely. Here's where the psychology gets deeper. INFJs operate with what I'd call an emotional threshold. Once that threshold is crossed, there's no warning shot, no heated argument, no gradual pulling away. Instead, they retreat instantly, almost coldly, because in their mind, they've already processed the loss. They've been grieving the relationship in silence, long before you even knew it was in danger. So when they disappear, it feels sudden to you, but for them, it was inevitable. And here's the part most people miss. Disappearing is not an act of cruelty. It's not punishment, it's protection. By walking away, the INFJ is finally acknowledging that they can't keep carrying everyone else's weight while ignoring their own breaking point. It's a moment of self-respect disguised as silence. If you've ever had an INFJ in your life vanish without explanation, this is usually the reason. It wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive, it was the result of 1,000 little moments that added up until disappearing felt like the only way to breathe again. And if you're an INFJ yourself, you know exactly what I mean. You felt that tipping point, that moment where you realized you had nothing left to give, and instead of lashing out, you simply folded back into yourself. 2. Their withdrawal is about preservation, not punishment. When an INFJ disappears right when you need them most, it's easy to assume it's some form of punishment, like they're trying to make you feel what they've felt. But that's not what's happening. What looks like rejection from the outside is actually an act of self-preservation on the inside. You have to understand this. INFJs live in a constant state of emotional input. They don't just hear what you say, they hear the tone you said it in, the hesitation in your voice, the body language you tried to hide. It's like being a human antenna, tuned to every subtle frequency in the room. And while that gift makes them incredible friends, partners, and listeners, it also means they absorb an overwhelming amount of energy. So when their system is overloaded, disappearing is their way of shutting down the noise. It's not about you, it's about survival. Imagine being on a computer with dozens of programs running at once, all demanding attention. Eventually, the machine slows, overheats, and crashes. That's what happens to an INFJ emotionally. They process so much, so deeply, that if they don't unplug, they burn out completely. Withdrawal becomes a way of rebooting, of recharging, of resetting boundaries that were slowly being eroded without anyone realizing it. This is why INFJs vanish quietly instead of announcing it. If they tried to explain to everyone why they need space, they'd be pulled right back into the emotional tug of war they're trying to escape. And for them, that defeats the purpose. They don't want to argue about whether their need for distance is justified. They don't want to negotiate their peace. They just want to find it. So they leave silently, not as a form of spite, but because words in those moments feel like anchors dragging them back into chaos. Another thing to understand is that INFJ withdrawal isn't random, it's patterned. They disappear when their boundaries have been crossed repeatedly, when they've said yes too many times, when they've carried burdens that weren't theirs to carry, when they've tried to fix problems that weren't theirs to solve. Every time they ignore their own needs, they move one step closer to vanishing. And by the time they finally do, it's not about a single betrayal or disappointment, it's about the slow erosion of their energy over time. Here's where the psychology of INFJs makes them different from most people. Many people, when overwhelmed, lash out, argue, or make demands. INFJs don't. They withdraw inward. They cut off access to their presence because presence is their greatest gift. Think about it. When an INFJ is with you, they're fully with you. They listen like your words matter. They look at you like they can see through your mask. They make you feel validated in ways few people can. That presence is rare, and when they disappear, the sudden absence of it feels like a void. That's the punishment people often interpret, but in reality, it's just the INFJ finally keeping something for themselves. And here's the part most people miss. An INFJ's withdrawal is often temporary. It's a cycle. They pull back not to end things, but to rebuild themselves. If they return, it's usually with more clarity, more strength, and more boundaries. But if someone doesn't understand this cycle and takes the disappearance personally, the INFJ may decide it's not worth coming back. They'd rather protect their peace than explain themselves to someone who never cared to understand their silence in the first place. So if you've ever had an INFJ in your life vanish when you thought you needed them most, don't jump to anger. Don't assume they abandoned you out of coldness or punishment. More often than not, they were drowning in a tide of emotional overload that you never even saw, and disappearing was their way of staying alive in a world that never stops demanding more of them. 3. They measure trust by energy, not words. One of the hardest truths to grasp about INFJs is that their loyalty isn't built on what you say, it's built on how your presence feels. You can give all the promises, excuses, or reassurances you want, but for an INFJ, words are background noise compared to energy. And when that energy starts to shift, even in the smallest way, they feel it long before you ever admit it. That's why they seem to disappear suddenly. To you, everything might feel fine. To them, they've already tracked the slow erosion of trust, piece by piece, in ways you never even noticed. Think about how most people measure trust: consistency in actions, honesty in conversations, reliability in promises. INFJs go deeper than that. They notice micro expressions, tone shifts, hesitation in your words, and contradictions between your behavior and your intentions. They may not call it out in the moment, but it gets stored every time. And unlike others who brush things off, INFJs don't forget. They build a quiet archive of those red flags until one day it tips the scale. That's when they disappear. But here's what makes their disappearance even more misunderstood. They often won't confront you directly about the issues they've noticed. To them, confrontation feels exhausting because it rarely leads to real change. Instead, they rely on patterns. If your words say one thing, but your actions say another, they believe your actions. If your energy feels off, they trust their intuition. So when they withdraw, it's not impulsive, it's the result of watching, waiting, and validating their instincts over time. This is why their disappearance can feel so confusing to others. You may feel blindsided because you didn't even know there was a problem, but in their mind, the decision has been building for weeks, months, sometimes years. By the time they leave, they've already rehearsed it 100 times in their head. They've measured the emotional cost of staying against the cost of leaving, and leaving always comes out lighter. Another layer here is how deeply INFJs value emotional congruence. They thrive when your words, actions, and energy all align. That's what makes them feel safe, but the moment those pieces stop lining up, they start pulling back. And here's the part people often misunderstand. INFJs don't need you to be perfect. What they need is honesty. If you're struggling, if you're flawed, if you're inconsistent but willing to own it, they'll stay. But if you present a mask, if you pretend, if you try to manipulate the picture they see, they'll quietly distance themselves. Because INFJs don't get fooled by the mask, they get hurt by the dishonesty behind it. And that's why INFJs disappearing is rarely about a single betrayal. It's about the cumulative weight of small moments where energy didn't match words, where promises didn't match actions, and where authenticity got lost in the fog of pretense. They'd rather step away than live in that constant state of unease. For them, withdrawal isn't just about preservation, it's about integrity. They refuse to remain in spaces where truth is absent, no matter how much they care for the person involved. So the next time you wonder why an INFJ vanished just when you needed them, ask yourself, what story was your energy telling? Because chances are they picked up on it long before you ever put it into words. 4. Their disappearance isn't about punishment, it's about protection. One of the biggest misconceptions about INFJs disappearing is that they're doing it to teach you a lesson or to get revenge. That couldn't be further from the truth. When an INFJ walks away, it's not a game and it's not manipulation, it's survival. Their disappearance is rarely about you at all. It's about protecting their own emotional, mental, and even physical well-being. And that's what makes their quiet detachment so powerful and so permanent. INFJs are naturally wired to give. They pour themselves into relationships with an intensity that few other types can match. When you're close to an INFJ, you know it, because they're not halfway people. They don't dabble in relationships, they commit fully. They remember the smallest details about you, they anticipate your needs before you even say them, and they'll sacrifice their time and energy just to make you feel understood. But the very thing that makes INFJs extraordinary also puts them at risk, because when they keep giving and the balance is never restored, they eventually burn out. And unlike some who recover with a bit of rest, INFJs hit a point where they realize this isn't exhaustion anymore. This is destruction. That's when their instinct to disappear kicks in. It's not about anger. It's not about dramatics. It's not even about proving a point. It's about recognizing that if they stay, they'll lose themselves entirely. So they cut the cord. And when they do, it looks sudden from the outside, but inside it's been building like pressure in a volcano. By the time they go silent, the decision has already been finalized in their mind. And here's the irony most people never grasp. INFJs don't want to disappear. They don't want to withdraw from people they once cared about. In fact, the act of walking away usually breaks their heart. But they've learned the hard way that staying in situations where their needs are ignored, where their intuition is dismissed, or where their empathy is exploited is far more damaging than the pain of leaving. Disappearance becomes the only choice that preserves their identity. Another important piece to understand is that INFJs don't leave with noise. They don't slam doors, they don't make public declarations, they don't beg to be seen, they vanish with quiet finality. And that silence speaks louder than any words they could have used. People who've been on the receiving end of this silence often misinterpret it. They think the INFJ is being cold or punishing them. In reality, that silence is the INFJ's way of reclaiming their peace. They're not shutting you out to wound you, they're shutting down the chaos to heal themselves. Think of it this way. When a firefighter retreats from a burning building, it's not because they don't care about what's inside. It's because the flames have reached a point where staying would mean collapse. INFJs retreat for the same reason. They've already tried to rescue the relationship, already extended understanding, already given far more chances than most would. Their disappearance is the final act of self-preservation, a way of stepping out of the fire before they're consumed by it. This is also why INFJs don't come back once they've left. People often expect that their silence is temporary, that they'll return after a break, or that they're just testing the waters. But that's not how an INFJ operates. Once they've chosen disappearance as protection, going back would mean betraying themselves. And if there's one thing an INFJ refuses to do after reaching that point, it's self-betrayal. So when you see an INFJ disappear, understand this. It's not about punishing you. It's not about proving something. It's about saving themselves. And by the time you notice they're gone, it's already too late to undo what led them there. 5. Their absence speaks louder than any words. When an INFJ disappears, the silence they leave behind is deafening. Most people underestimate how powerful absence can be until they're faced with it. With an INFJ, their absence becomes its own kind of communication, and in many cases, it says far more than words ever could. Think about how most conflicts play out in relationships. When tension builds, people argue, shout, explain, or demand clarity. But INFJs are different. When they've reached their breaking point, they don't storm out with dramatic speeches. They don't sit you down for one last warning. They vanish quietly. And that silence leaves you scrambling with unanswered questions. It's that very lack of explanation that makes their absence sting so much. You're forced to sit with the weight of what you've done and the realization that there's no chance to explain yourself or defend your actions. That's because INFJs understand something most people don't. Words can be manipulated, twisted, and dismissed. But absence can't be denied. When they stop showing up, when they stop checking in, when the warmth and attentiveness you once relied on is gone, that's reality staring you in the face. You can't gaslight someone's disappearance. You can't argue with silence. It becomes undeniable proof that something broke beyond repair. The impact of this silence is magnified by how deeply INFJs give before they ever walk away. If you've had an INFJ in your life, you know what it feels like to have their presence. They notice things about you that others don't. They remember details about your life that you may have forgotten yourself. They make you feel seen, valued, and cared for in a way that's rare. So when all of that disappears overnight, the contrast is brutal. You don't just lose a person, you lose the reflection of yourself that they once held up for you. And that's why so many people only realize the depth of an INFJ's presence after it's gone. It's almost like a withdrawal. You feel the absence in the quiet moments when you expect their message and it doesn't come. When you face a challenge and realize they're not there to support you anymore. When you remember the empathy and understanding they once gave and recognize you'll never feel it from them again. From the INFJ's perspective, this isn't about revenge. They don't disappear to make you suffer. They disappear because they've finally accepted that staying would mean suffering themselves. But the effect of that absence is undeniable. It forces the other person to confront what they lost, often too late. What makes INFJs unique is that their disappearance doesn't come with conditions. They don't leave and wait for you to prove yourself. They don't vanish expecting an apology or a grand gesture. When they go silent, it's final. And in that finality lies the true weight of their absence, because deep down, you realize that nothing you say or do can bring them back. This is why INFJ detachment carries such lasting impact. Their silence isn't passive, it's active, it's deliberate. It's the clearest statement they'll ever make, that their peace and self-respect matter more than any relationship, no matter how much they once cared. And once you've experienced the void of their absence, you'll understand why INFJs are both unforgettable and irreplaceable. 6. Detachment protects their inner world. When an INFJ disappears, most people only see the surface, the unanswered calls, the distance, the sudden silence. What they don't realize is that this withdrawal is never just about the other person. It's about protection. For INFJs, detachment is the only way to safeguard their inner world from further damage once trust has been broken. You see, INFJs don't let people into their inner world easily. They might be warm, friendly, and empathetic on the outside, but the deepest parts of themselves are guarded. When they do decide to open up, it's because they've chosen to trust you with a level of access that very few people ever get. This is what makes betrayal or consistent disrespect cut so deeply for them. It's not just about the act itself, it's about the invasion of a space they rarely allow anyone to enter. When that boundary is violated, detachment becomes a survival strategy. It's not an impulsive reaction, it's a carefully considered decision rooted in self-preservation. INFJs know that if they continue to engage, they'll end up giving more of themselves away, bleeding energy into a connection that only drains them further. Instead of escalating, arguing, or pleading, they retreat. And that retreat isn't weakness, it's strength. It's them reclaiming control over what they can't control externally, how much of themselves they allow others to touch. From the outside, this detachment can feel cold, even cruel. One day you're sharing conversations, laughs, or emotional support, and the next day it feels like a door has been slammed shut. But inside the INFJ's mind, that door isn't closed out of spite. It's closed because they've finally realized the cost of keeping it open. They understand that their peace, clarity, and self-respect can't survive in an environment where they're constantly undercut or dismissed. This protective detachment is also why INFJs often seem unshakable once they've disappeared. While others may beg for closure, try to guilt trip them, or attempt to re-enter their lives, the INFJ has already fortified themselves internally. They've processed the pain in silence, they've sat with their emotions, and by the time they walk away, they've already detached emotionally. It's not about anger anymore. It's about refusing to hand over any more of their inner world to someone who didn't value it in the first place. And here's the irony. People often underestimate just how much INFJs feel because they don't always express it outwardly. They assume that silence means indifference, when in reality it's the opposite. It's the result of feeling so much, so intensely, that the only option is to stop exposing themselves to further harm. Their detachment isn't about not caring. It's about caring too much and knowing they can't afford to keep doing it for the wrong person. What makes this especially powerful is that once INFJs have detached, they don't second-guess themselves. They don't look back months later wishing they'd said more or fought harder. They've learned that detachment protects their soul, and once they've experienced that relief, they rarely reopen the door. For the other person, this can feel devastating. They may try everything to get back in, but the INFJ has already built a wall of self-protection too strong to climb. In the end, INFJ detachment teaches a hard but necessary truth. When they disappear, it's not to punish you, it's to protect themselves. And once they choose that path, their inner world becomes impenetrable, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom earned from pain. 7. Silence becomes their final answer. One of the hardest truths about INFJs is that when they've had enough, their silence is louder than any words they could ever speak. While most people argue, defend themselves, or try to explain their feelings in endless conversations, the INFJ does the opposite. They choose silence as their final answer, and that silence speaks volumes. Why? Because INFJs have already given you the benefit of the doubt. They've explained themselves before, they've dropped hints, shared their feelings, and tried to meet you halfway. They've done the emotional labor of holding space for your mistakes and waiting for you to notice the damage. When all of that fails, silence becomes the only tool left. But it's not passive, it's an active, deliberate choice that says more than words ever could. For the INFJ, silence isn't avoidance, it's closure. By withdrawing words, they're also withdrawing access. Their silence communicates, I've reached the point where nothing I say will matter, so I'm saving my energy for myself. And that message hits differently because it's not fueled by anger, but by finality. They're not waiting for you to change or apologize. They're showing you that they've already closed the book. This is where many people underestimate INFJs the most. They think silence is an opening, that maybe if they push harder, the INFJ will eventually crack and start talking again, but they misunderstand the depth of this withdrawal. When an INFJ goes silent, it's not a game. It's not about punishment or trying to manipulate guilt. It's about reclaiming peace. They've stepped out of the drama completely, and in doing so, they've made it impossible for you to drag them back into it. The impact of this silence is often devastating to the other person. Humans are wired to seek responses, to want explanations, to crave closure. So when the INFJ refuses to argue, refuses to explain, and refuses to fight, the silence itself becomes a mirror. The other person is left to face themselves, their words, their actions, their consequences, without the INFJ softening the blow with conversation or reassurance. And here's the deeper layer. Silence is one of the INFJ's greatest strengths because it removes the manipulator's power. Think about it. Arguments can be twisted, apologies can be faked, promises can be broken, but silence can't be manipulated. Once the INFJ has decided they're done talking, there's nothing left to grab onto. The manipulator loses their stage, their audience, their control. And that loss is often what cuts the deepest. For the INFJ, silence also gives them room to heal. By stepping back, they stop the cycle of constant giving and emotional exhaustion. In silence, they rediscover their balance, their inner voice, and their perspective. It's where they process everything they've endured and finally put it into context. And when they come out the other side, they're stronger, clearer, and far less likely to ever let the same situation repeat. The irony is that the same silence people misinterpret as coldness is actually the INFJ's act of self-love. It's their way of saying, I matter too, my peace matters, my sanity matters. For someone who has spent so much of their life carrying the weight of others' emotions, that silence is revolutionary. It's not weakness, it's not indifference, it's the ultimate boundary. So when an INFJ disappears and leaves you with silence, understand that you're not waiting for them to come back. Their silence was their decision. Their silence was their goodbye. And if you're on the receiving end of it, you'll realize too late that the quiet you took for granted was actually the loudest message you'll ever get. 8. Detachment becomes their final act of self-respect. When an INFJ finally reaches the end of their patience, detachment is the last and most defining step. Unlike anger, which is loud and fleeting, or forgiveness, which still leaves a door cracked open, detachment is permanent. It's the quiet decision to withdraw not only their presence, but also their emotional investment. And once that detachment happens, there's no going back. This stage is different from simple withdrawal or needing space. Detachment means the INFJ has emotionally severed the bond, even if physical ties still exist. They may still show up at work, live under the same roof, or remain polite in passing. But inside, something has shut down completely. That deep empathy and care they once poured into the connection, gone. That constant effort to understand and forgive, finished. Detachment is the moment when the INFJ shifts from giving to protecting. For the people on the receiving end, this change is shocking. They often mistake the INFJ's patience for weakness, believing they'll always be there no matter what. But the very moment that bond snaps, they realize just how much they relied on the INFJ's presence. Suddenly, conversations feel colder, the laughter is gone, the warmth in the room disappears, and no amount of pleading or promising can bring it back. Because the INFJ didn't just walk away physically, they walked away emotionally, and that is far harder to repair. Why is detachment so final for INFJs? Because they know what it costs them to keep holding on. Every betrayal, every disappointment, every repeated pattern eats away at their sense of self-worth. To stay connected after the trust is broken would mean betraying themselves. And for an INFJ who values authenticity above all else, that's unacceptable. Detachment becomes their way of saying, I will not sacrifice myself for your comfort. This choice isn't made lightly. In fact, INFJs wrestle with it for a long time before acting. They second-guess themselves, replay scenarios, and even blame themselves for not being enough. But when the scales finally tip, detachment arrives like a switch being flipped. There is no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet but unshakable decision that the connection no longer serves their peace. The impact of this detachment is long-lasting. For the INFJ, it means freedom, the freedom to reclaim their energy, rebuild their identity, and focus on relationships that truly value them. For the other person, it often leaves a haunting absence. They realize too late that the INFJ's presence was never guaranteed. That empathy they abused, the patience they tested, the love they took for granted, it's all gone, replaced by silence and distance that can never be bridged. Detachment is the INFJ's ultimate boundary. It's not about revenge, it's not about punishment, it's about survival. By cutting ties completely, they protect their spirit from being drained any further. And in that choice, they remind the world of one undeniable truth. An INFJ's kindness is infinite, but it is not free. When you betray it, you lose it forever. So when an INFJ detaches, it's the end of the story. Not a pause, not a break, not a test. The connection is over, and the silence that follows is the proof. And if you're on the receiving end of that detachment, you'll come to understand that losing an INFJ is one of the deepest losses you'll ever face, because once they're gone for good. And this is the truth about INFJs. When they stop caring, it isn't sudden and it isn't cruel. It's the result of every unspoken hurt, every ignored boundary, and every betrayal that piled up until silence became the only answer left. By the time they disappear, they've already fought the battle inside themselves and chosen self-respect over endless sacrifice. If you've ever been on the receiving end of an INFJ's quiet detachment, you know the emptiness it leaves behind. And if you are an INFJ, you understand the painful but necessary strength it takes to walk away. Either way, it's a reminder of just how rare and powerful their presence truly is. If this resonated with you, make sure you subscribe, not just for more psychology videos, but because every story, every insight brings you closer to understanding the deeper layers of yourself and the people around you. And here's my question for you. Have you ever reached that point of quiet detachment where you knew you were done for good,